I'm Paul McKeever. The other day I was watching the Rubin Report, which is a popular interview show hosted by Dave Rubin on YouTube. And he was having a question and answer session, and some of his supporters were writing in questions to him. And one of the questions he was given was something to the effect of, are you a minarchist, or would you support minarchism?
Okay. Do you like mini-archasm? In libertarian political philosophy, a night watchman state, or mini-archasm, I guess, is a model of a state whose only functions are to provide its citizens with the military, the police, the courts, thus protecting them from aggression, theft, breach of contract, and fraud, and enforcing property laws. I mean, that's not that far from what an ideal libertarian state would be. So what you just laid out there for me is pretty congruent with most of the things that I believe, but I would need to know a little bit more.
Now, it was clear to me that Dave had not heard that term before. He has been on this political journey. He's come from being what he thought was a progressive to learning that perhaps he's more of an advocate of free speech than his fellow progressives were. And so he's on this political journey, and so it was only natural that this might be the first time he came across this not so common term, minarchism. In any event, it reminded me of a project that I started writing. It was actually a chapter for a book. I started writing it about, 10, 13 years ago, and I largely left it to the side to pursue other things. It was a guide on how to categorize governments. And so I thought, why not now? If shows like Dave Rubin's are taking off, and they're very popular. There's Dave Rubin's show, there's Jordan Peterson's show, Sam Harris's show, Ben Shapiro's show, and these fellas all, although they come from various different backgrounds, all talk about politics and political terms, and they're all on their own voyages that they're sharing with us. So I hoped to contribute in my own way to help keep the ideas clear in the people's heads. Everybody who's talking about these things, it's useful to have a common lexicon when discussing government and what its role is and what its nature is, and that's what I'm going to provide to you today. Now, at the end of this discussion, I'm going to argue that there is only one organization that deserves to be called government. The rest are not government, but for us to get to that point, it will be necessary to talk about this concept of the categorization of governments, of different kinds of governments. I don't think there are different kinds of governments, but I'm going to show you how the things that people call governments are rightly categorized. All right? So let's start at the beginning. What are the three things that define the nature of a particular type of what people are calling government? There are three things. The first thing that should be considered when categorizing a government is, who is the executor? Who is the person or persons who will ultimately be responsible for executing the laws, carrying out the laws? The second important question is, what is the source of the power that is exercised by that executor? So that there's an executor, they're exercising powers as the government, and what is the source? Where do they get that power? Who made them king, you might say? The third, and I'm going to argue ultimately the most important thing that you have to consider when categorizing government, is the scope of the power that is exercised by the executor as government. So let's deal with each of these one by one, and I'll give you not only an idea of what I mean by each of these things, but the correct terminology to be used for each of these three items. Let's start first by just saying, what is a government? Generally speaking, and this is not a very good definition, it's a very gross one that helps us with this process. A government is a thing that has a monopoly on the use of force. It uses force to require people to do various things or to prevent them from doing various things. So when we're talking about the executor of the power, we're talking about the person who is the one exercising the power to use force to get people to do things or to prevent them from doing different things. That's the executor. Now, in this categorization process, we borrow a lot of words primarily from the Greeks, a little bit from the Romans. And when we speak about executors, we're talking about who is the leader, who is the ruler, if you will. And the Greek word for leader is archos. And that's where we get things like in the English language, when we talk about political terms, we get terms that end in archy. So for example, we have situations in which the executor is a single person, one, mono, mon, and they are a leader or ruler, so it's monarchy. And for example, we have in Canada a queen. She is the one person who, at least in theory, is the executor of the power that is exercised by government. Instead of a single person being the executor, we could have a few people being the executor. The Greek word for the few or few is oligos. And so if we have the few who are the executor, the ones who are using power to make people do things, to prevent them from doing things as government, we call that an oligarchy. Now, incidentally, we could argue that in Canada, because the Queen is only a titular head of state, that the real head of state is actually the various ministers, the Minister of Finance, the Minister of Defense, the Prime Minister, etc., that they together execute the laws of the land. And because they are the few, we could say that it's an oligopoly. In fact, we could even say in Canada that because those ministers are going to take their marching orders from the Prime Minister, he's kind of a monarch. So there you go. If it's one person who is the executor, it's a monarchy. If it's a few people, it's an oligarchy. Now, the range of people who might be said to be the executor is relatively broad. For example, you could say that the wealthy are the people who will who execute the power of government. And the Greek word for wealth or wealthy, the wealthy, is plutos. And so we could say there's a plutocracy. We might speak of fatherly men as being the executor of the power exercised by government. The patriarch, if we use the Greek word, and so we have a patriarchy, if you want to delve into feminist terms, but that would be the idea that when we say patriarchy, this fatherly figure is the executor of the power. Now, some people don't want there to be a ruler at all, no leader, no one executing the power of government, and those people use the term, rightly, anarchy, meaning not archy, not ruler, not leader, no leader without leader. In other words, without, no, etc., is the an part of anarchy, and the archy is the leader or the ruler. And that's a proper term. Now, there's another popular kind of executor that I haven't mentioned yet, and that's because it doesn't fall into the category of using Greek words to describe it. Rather, it relies upon or borrows from Roman words. And that is the kind of government in which basically everyone who is the governed, the people or persons or whatever you want to call them, human beings, are together, or each of them, the executor of themselves. Now, normally, of course, we don't have, in the United States, for example, 300 or 400 million people that are all sitting there making decisions, executing government decisions. And what they do instead is they elect a person to preside as their representative, a president. So the president is the representative of all of the people, even though someone will argue, well, I didn't vote for him. Doesn't matter, he's your president, as many people will say. So he is the representative of all the people. He is the executor, the person who carries out or exercises the power that is held by government. Whatever that power is, we haven't gotten to that yet, but the president is the executor in this form of government. Now, as I said, the name for this kind of executor, where all the people are the executor, usually represented by a president, it comes not from the Greek, but from the Roman, and it's made up of two parts. One is res, and the other is publicus. Res meaning thing, publicus meaning of the people. And you put those two together, and what do you get? Republic. So a republic is a government in which the executor is all of the people, typically represented by someone who presides on their behalf, a president. Now, just before I close off this section about the executors, I want to address this word that was put to Dave Rubin, minarchy. Is that a kind of executor? And the answer is no. It's a junk word. It's a malformed word. Minarchists, or people who speak about minarchy, are talking about limited government. That's what they intend the word to mean, limited government, minarchy, small minimum. And then archy, they don't even think about what archy means. They think of it as the scope of the power of the government, but that's not the case. Archos is a reference to leader or ruler. So think about this. You can't have an amount of ruler, all right? There's no amount of Queen Elizabeth. There isn't even an amount of a short guy named Napoleon, okay? There's only a ruler or not a ruler. There's either an archos or there's an archos. There is either someone who's an executor or someone who is not. There is not a minimal amount of an executor. So that whole term is garbage. Take it out of your lexicon, throw it to the side. There are better ways to describe governments that don't have unlimited power, and we'll get into that. So let's move on to the next consideration when categorizing government. Let's talk about the source of a government, with Mao Zedong having said that all power grows from the barrel of a gun. We're not talking about that sense of where power comes from. We're talking about really from whom does power come, or what, but generally from whom does the government get its power. So let's talk about power just for a second. From the Greek, we get the word kratos, meaning power. All right, and that's why we see words such as democratic or democracy or theocracy, etc. We're talking about something power. So whenever we're talking about the source of a government's power, we're talking about something crassy. So what are the different sources or alleged sources of government power? Well, one is God. Okay, and what's the Greek word for God? Theos. So we put together theos and crassy, and what do we get? Theocracy. And that means that God is the source of the government's power. Whatever power the government has, it was given to it by God, or it's serving God with that power. What if it's not God? What if the person who came to power basically barged in with some guns and there was a military coup and they say, I'm going to do whatever I want to do? That person's claiming that they got power not from any God or anybody else, but from themselves. And the Greek word for self is autos. And so we have autocracy, autocracy. So a self-sourced government, a government that claims that its power comes from itself and that it didn't need to get it from anybody else, is an autocracy. All right, well, what about the kind of government that we're a little bit more familiar with, where we believe that the power of the government comes from the governed, from the people who are governed? Well, what the people, the word there in Greek is demos. And so we put together demos and the word for power, crassy, and we get democracy. And that's, of course, where the government gets its power, at least in theory, from the people that it governs, okay? Now, I'm going to hear howls of protest from people who say, no, democracy doesn't mean that you get your power from the people. It means the people actually make the decisions, and that's incorrect. You'll be hearing that, you'll be reading that in dictionaries, you'll be seeing it in newspapers, but that's not the case. Democracy is not about who makes the decisions. That's archy, remember, that's the executor. Different suffix altogether. Crassy is about power. Where does the power come from? Power comes from the people in a democracy, but that does not imply that they are the executor of that power. Now, there are a whole host of other kinds of alleged crassies. Okay, I've got a list here. Let me just read them to you. You've got bureaucracy. You've got meritocracy. You've got aristocracy, and as I said, plutocracy. So what do people mean by these terms when they use them? Well, generally, they mean them as follows. When they talk about a meritocracy, they're talking about people who are executing power because they have merit. And when they talk about a bureaucracy, they're talking about people who are executing power because they're civil servants. They work for the government. When they talk about a plutocracy, they're talking about people who are executing power because they have all the money or they have a lot of money. When they talk about an aristocracy, aristos means best or the best people. And an aristocracy would mean that the best people are calling the shots. They're the ones who are executing power. But you'll notice that executing power in each of these cases, meritocracy, plutocracy, these are not really what crassy means. Crassy, again, is a reference to power, where the power comes from, not who the executor of the power is. So these words are all malformed. They're garbage words. Do not put them in your lexicon. If you need to talk about power coming from the people who have merit, I guess there might be some form of government in which that happens, or power comes from the rich, or where power comes from people who work for the government. That seems really odd. But generally speaking, the wrong suffix has been put on these words: merit, bureau, Pluto, and aristo. Okay, so these are bad words. They shouldn't be in your lexicon because they're actually using the wrong suffix for the way people usually use those words.
Oh Lord, why have you chosen me? What would you have me do for you?
I shall give you my laws, and you shall take them unto the people.
Yes, Lord! Lord, I shall give these laws unto thy people. Hear me! Oh, hear me! All pay heed! The Lord Jehovah, has given unto you these 10 commandments for all to obey.
So we might ask the question, is the power of the government unlimited? Can it kill you for not wearing blue on Tuesdays? Can it imprison you because you eat food on a Wednesday that you shouldn't eat because it's a holy food, or because you've insulted a prophet? Can it take your money away because you made too much, etc.? Or is the government's power relatively limited? Does it, for example, have only the power to defend your life, your liberty, and your property, to prevent people from taking your life, your liberty, or your property without your consent? Now, I'll submit to you that the best way to correctly determine what the scope of a government's power is to look at where it's coming from. So let's look first, for example, at an autocracy, where the power comes from the self, when the power comes from the person who says he's the government. In that case, because the power is coming from the person who's the executor, the dictator, the power is going to be pretty much unlimited. The government will do whatever they're capable of doing, physically and mentally capable of doing, whatever they have the machinery to do, etc. This is largely going to be, an autocracy is largely going to be a government without any limits, at least no theoretical limits, on the scope of its power. It will use power for good, for evil, however it wants to use it, but there won't be any limits imposed by the source because it's taking itself to be the source. Now let's look next at theocracy. What if the power of government is coming from a god, allegedly? Well, in that case, the power of government is going to be limited to whatever the god has for power and what the god thinks the power should be used to do or not to do. So, for example, if you have a god that is said to be everywhere, to know everything, to have unlimited power, then the power that the god confers on the government will be whatever portion of that power the god wants to be used. In other words, the god will confer the power on the condition that it only be used in the following ways, to do what the god says it should be used to do, not to do what the god would never do with it, which is in other words, not to do what shouldn't be done with the power. And so therefore you see a scope that, depending on what the god says is what should be done with his power, gives the government more or less power. So let's consider now democracy. What is democracy again? Well, democracy is power from people. And so the question is, well, what power does a person have? Well, the answer to that question, because you'll remember, it's not only about what is physically possible or mentally possible, but also what should you do. In other words, what should a person do? That's the power that they would exercise in a given way, the way they should exercise it. And whatever that should is, whatever that power is that's used in the correct way, that is the power that a democracy confers on the executor, on the government. And so you'll ask yourself, well, what is that power? How should power be used? And what do we mean by power? Remember, government is using force to get people to do things or to prevent them from doing things. And so when we say power should be used in a certain way, we mean force should be used in a certain way by the government. Well, how do we know then what an individual, a human being, the person who's giving government power, how do we know how they should use force? And the answer to that question, of course, has to be drawn not from any kind of contract or mystical insight or etc. It comes from whatever is the appropriate ethical philosophy for a human being. Now, you might argue that there's a million different forms of ethics, and I won't disagree that there's lots of writers, but in general, there are really only two kinds of ethical philosophies. The ones in which the person is trying to survive and pursue his own happiness, and the kinds in which the person doing the right thing is expected to sacrifice of himself so that others can survive and live. Okay? So the first kind, if it's done properly, if you're acting the way you should in order to survive and to pursue your own happiness, then there's only one way to do that, and that's consistently with human nature. You'll have to know what the human nature is, which is a matter of what is. In other words, metaphysics and epistemology. Those are two branches of philosophy that come before ethics. But once you've identified what a human being is, you can then say, okay, look, dead people don't need a code of ethics. Therefore, a code of ethics should be one in which the purpose of the code is to help the person live this life on this earth. Okay? And how do you do that? Well, what kind of philosophy does that? The philosophy that does that is the philosophy that helps a person identify the kinds of values that are consistent with their own happiness, that identifies their own happiness as the purpose of living in the first place, and that identifies the virtues, the things, the kinds of qualities that will allow them to pursue successfully and to obtain successfully those values, money, love, etc., upon which their survival and their happiness depends. So we call that kind of philosophy rational egoism. Rational because if it was irrational, it'd just be craziness, okay? And so we're talking about something that's well-planned, that it works in the long term, and egoism because it concerns the self, your happiness, your own happiness, not the happiness of others or the non-suffering of others, but your own happiness, your own survival. What's the alternative to that? Selflessness, giving of the self. In other words, altruism. That's what it means, the otherism. And in an altruist system, your highest good really is to sacrifice. The purpose is not to pursue your own happiness, but to assist others to survive. Not necessarily in a happy form, but in other words, to stop them from dying, to stop them from suffering from sickness, etc. And so your whole purpose, if you are an altruist, is not for you to survive or for you to pursue happiness, but to help others survive. You know, Jesus is dying on the cross. There's your ultimate altruist. He's literally allowing himself to be killed so that others may live. And that's why Jesus is held up as sort of the hero of the altruist Christian faith. All right? So those are the two main kinds, and they're competing. They're not the same. They're competing kinds of ethical philosophy. One says, pursue happiness by taking rational steps to collect the values and earn the values you need to achieve that happiness and survival. The other, altruism, says, sacrifice of yourselves in order to make your neighbor happy. In other words, give him your food rather than eating if he's hungry. Work for him and don't expect money for it, rather than working for money for your own wealth, etc. Or give him your money after you've worked for it. That's altruism. Now, I'm going to suggest to you that if you're going to have a thing that uses power correctly, that exercises force correctly, if you're going to have a government, it has to be something that isn't, it doesn't have two conflicting forms, okay? So if you're going to have a government be a thing that defends your life, liberty, and property, prevents your neighbor from taking your life, liberty, and property without your consent, then if that's going to be a government, it's going to have limited powers, it's going to be defending your right to make choices on this earth, in this life. If that's a government, then that which takes away your life, takes away your liberty, takes away your property is not a government. Let me just simplify that. If a government is that which defends your life, liberty, and property, it can't also be a thing that takes away your life, liberty, and property. If a government is a thing that takes away your life, liberty, and property, it can't also be a thing that defends your life, liberty, and property. A government can't be both things. There isn't two kinds of poison, the poisonous kind and the non-poisonous kind. That's basically the idea here. So you recall at the beginning I said there's really only one form of government. That's why I say that. Because either government operates on the acknowledgement that rational egoism is the right code of ethics for a human being, or it operates on the belief that altruism is the right code of ethics for a human being. And those will have very different outcomes. If the government is defending your life, liberty, and property, if that's the power it gets from you, it can't do things to you like take away your life, liberty, and property without your consent. If, on the other hand, the right code of ethics is altruism, then if that's the code of ethics for a human being, then when human beings in a democracy give power to the government, they are giving government the power to sacrifice people for the good of others. That's what it does. And what does that mean? Well, that it means that the government can, for example, punish you if it's good for your neighbor's spiritual happiness. For example, if you use words that upset your neighbor, maybe they should be censored. If you spend a lot of money while your neighbor is starving, maybe that money should be taken and given to your neighbor, etc. Redistributing wealth, silencing you for saying words that hurt the feelings of your neighbor, putting you in prison for things like smoking pot because your neighbor thinks it's contrary to good morals or God or whatever. He thinks that your purpose is to serve his happiness, to make him content. Or maybe you're being put in prison, or you're being enslaved, or you're being expropriated because the neighbor, the only legitimate neighbor, someone is saying, can't be Jewish, or can't be black, or what have you. Altruism says, therefore, sacrifice those for the good of the better people, the good people, or the only legitimate people, or the only human beings if they get that barbaric. So what I'm talking about there is a government that gets its power from people who think that the correct moral code for human beings is altruism. So if you think there's a tie here between a government that gets its power from altruistic people and a government that gets its power from rationally egoistic people, well, let's examine that. What sort of ethics is one by which you die? You see, dead people don't need a code of ethics, and it is impossible to live by a code of altruism. Nobody ever survived by sacrificing of himself. If everyone's sacrificing, nobody's gaining. If everybody's gaining, nobody's sacrificing. If you're actually living by a code of altruism, you're dying by a code of altruism. That is all that can happen. If you're being faithful to altruism, all you do is chop off a toe, give people your food, give away all your money, and ultimately die. It's not consistent with life on earth. It might be consistent if you believe in an afterlife, and that's, of course, where all of that afterlife stuff comes from, and altruism. You know, sacrifice in this life. When you die, don't worry about it. This life is just a testing ground. You get everlasting happiness, effortless happiness in an afterlife. Okay, fine. If that's what you want to do, live for an afterlife, it does mean that, according to those religions, normally that's where you're going to get that code, you're going to be miserable in this life. But if on the other, and what do you need a government for if you're going to be dying anyway, right? Government is for people who want to live on this earth, who want to pursue happiness and survive in this life on this earth. And therefore, the only form of government is one that defends your life, liberty, and your property, that prevents people from taking it from you without your consent. What does that mean for all these other kinds of governments? For theocracies, for autocracies, even for democracies in which people think that altruism is the correct moral code, it means they're all the same. They are not government. What are they? They're organizations of human beings who will go around violating your life, liberty, and property, typically because they don't want people pursuing their own happiness and survival on this planet, in this life, for whatever reason. Either because they think that this life doesn't matter, and that by torturing you in this life, they'll somehow earn themselves a place in heaven later on, or because they just don't feel that they're competent to pursue their own happiness, and they expect you to provide it to them on a silver platter. Now, I'd just like to comment at this point about a small distinction that's often made, especially by people who consider themselves objectivists, high-ranking ones, well-informed ones. They will often say that, for example, the United States is not a democracy, it's a republic. And so I hope you can now see that that's a false distinction. You can have a republic that is a democracy because whereas republic refers to the executor, democracy refers to the source of the power that is exercised by the executor. These are two separate categories of things. They are not competing sources. They are not competing executors. They are two things. You can have a republic that is democratic. You can have a republic that is autocratic. You can have a republic that is theocratic. It does not mean the same thing. Democracy and republicanism are not competitors for one another. One is talking about the executor, that's republic. The other is talking about the source of the power, and that is democracy. there you go. That's government in a nutshell. And I hope you enjoy this presentation. Thank you.